Thanks everyone for joining us today for the first Strengthening Families Networking webinar of 2024. I'm very glad that you're all with us today and looking forward to our presentation from Claire Luge about considering yourself a mandated supporter. So before we get into the topic, I'll just make sure everybody knows where you are and why you're here. We do these webinars once a month for our Strengthening Families National Network. It is an open invitation to anyone who's using the Strengthening Families Protective Factors framework, coordinating Strengthening Families efforts, whether that's for your program or agency or your state. We jointly convene these between my organization, the Center for the Study of Social Policy, and our partners at the Children's Trust Fund Alliance. And each month we have a different topic and guest speaker. We coordinate those between CSSP and the Alliance, but we always welcome volunteers and suggestions. So feel free to reach out if there's something you would like to share on one of these webinars, or if you heard about something someone else is doing that you think we should all hear about, please let us know. The Alliance does maintain a webinar that has, I believe now, 13 years or so of these webinars with the recordings and slides and handouts. So check that out. I will put the link in the chat when I stop talking. And we can always, it might take until the beginning of next week before they're up there. You will also get an email from Zoom after the webinar, or 24 hours after the webinar, with a link to the recording there. But if you wait until it's posted, it will also have the slides. All right, so I always like to give you a sneak peek of what's coming up, and I'm very excited about next month's webinar. My colleague, Dr. Charlene Harper-Brown, will be sharing a paper that I've been telling you all about for a long time, called the Expanding the Perspectives and Research Foundation for CSSP's seminal framework, Strengthening Families and Youth Thrive. So we will be introducing that new paper and some other materials. And again, I'll put that registration link in the chat when I get it. I hope lots of people will join us for this exciting news. And then just March 14th, April 11th, mark your calendar. We will share the topics and send out the registration links as it gets closer. You can always go to our website, scroll down to the bottom of any page and sign up now for newsletters. You can choose the Strengthening Families newsletter and any other newsletters that you'd like to get from CSSP. All right, so getting into our topic for today is about considering yourself a mandated supporter. And this is, as you might guess, a training for people who are mandated reporters. Claire's going to talk about the training they've developed in Arizona through Prevent Child Abuse Arizona. And just wanted to, before we jump into that, Maureen and I both wanted to share a little bit of context from other work that our organizations are doing related to mandated reporting. So I think everyone is probably aware this is a very hot topic in the child welfare space about mandated reporting as a piece of a system that is not working very well, to put it mildly. And the training that Claire's going to talk about today is a modification or a way to work with people who are mandated reporters within that system to support how they're doing their job and engage them more in prevention. But that is part of a bigger landscape of efforts that are happening, policy advocacy to change how mandated reporting works overall, broader advocacy to reduce the need or presence of child welfare at all in communities. And so I see this as part of a big picture of work that's being done to really change how these systems work. And the training we're hearing about today is a really helpful step in making it work better within the current sort of parameters of what mandated reporting looks like. And Maureen, did you want to say a little bit about the Alliance's work in this area?
Yeah, just real quickly, I will say that the Children's Trust Fund joined with Casey Family Programs Birth Parent Advocacy Committee, which is called the BPAC, and they have worked on an issue brief that's going to come out that has focused on necessary changes to mandated reporting policies and practices. And the attempt with this brief is really to elevate the voices of the parents and to really talk about family support in order to narrow that front door to the child welfare system. So as soon as that comes out, I will share it with the group. And just to say, in addition, that our training of trainers has really started to have that conversation about making sure that we are supporters before reporters, which is what Claire's going to talk about here. And we have a great new audio that we have used from a childcare consultant that was actually able to intervene with a childcare and help them support a family before they were getting kind of ready to report, and had some really fantastic outcomes with that. So I'm really excited to hear everything Claire has to say. They have really led the way in a lot of ways in this work. So thank you.
All right, thank you. And with that, we're going to hand off to Claire Luge, our friend from Prevent Child Abuse Arizona. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks so much, Kaylin, Maureen, and Lucretia. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. But before I do, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Claire Luge. I'm the Executive Director of Prevent Child Abuse Arizona. We are a statewide nonprofit organization here in Arizona, and we're dedicated to strengthening families and protecting children. And the way that I like to frame it is we protect children by strengthening families, because one of the major things that we're doing, that we're all doing actually as strengthening families trainers, is shifting mindsets to help people understand that prevention is family support. Prevention is connecting families to what they need. Prevention is building protective factors so that intervention is not necessary. So today's presentation hopefully will not just be me lecturing at you. It will be you asking me questions and sharing comments in the chat as well. So I am monitoring the chat, by the way. So if you have any questions, you can pop them in there, or you can pop them in the Q&A. I like to answer questions as we're going because that's my preference. So please do that. Questions and comments are welcome. All righty. And if you hear whining in the background, it is a puppy that we got a few weeks ago. So they are kennel training, and just FYI. Can people see the screen yet? Yes, but it's not shared.
Right, we're seeing it in PowerPoint mode. There you go.
Okay, thumbs up. Beautiful. Thank you. Okay. So today, I'm going to be talking about a training that we have created at Prevent Child Abuse Arizona in collaboration with a couple of partners. I'm not actually going to give you the training. I'm going to talk about how we formed it. I am going to share a few slides. We're not going to go through the whole thing, but I'm going to give you how it was set up. But first, I'm going to talk about why. Why did we create a training called Considering Yourself a Mandated Supporter? Where did that concept come from? And why is there a need for that in our state and possibly across the nation? And then I'll share how we formed the training, and then a few slides of the training. And then I'm going to talk about the snags and the challenges that we faced, because for me, I always like to hear snags and challenges of people's projects. It is not useful to me when someone presents to me some perfect thing that they've done, and you know, it helps me see myself in it if they talk about their challenges too, because the concept of mandated reporting and mandated supporting, if you even want to call it that, these are complex, nuanced concepts. And so really, we're all learning, and we're all learning how we can best reform a system to achieve our shared vision of all families and children being thriving and well, and child and family well-being. Okay. So I'm going to share first the context. Why did we create this training called Considering Yourself a Mandated Supporter? So back in 2020, only 4 years ago, as we all know, the pandemic hit, and early in the pandemic lockdown, a lot of people were having conversations that were concerned about children and families. You were probably part of these conversations too. And they went something like, oh my gosh, we know that stress impacts families negatively, and that when family stress goes up, typically the likelihood of abuse and neglect also goes up. This pandemic is stressful. And we concluded there must be more abuse going on. And then the next question was, well, how do we spot this abuse and how do we keep on reporting this abuse if we can't see children and if they're not in the presence of protective adults and mandated reporters? So probably many of you were part of those kinds of conversations. I know I was. I know I was interviewed by a couple of reporters on this concept. People were really concerned that children were not okay. Okay, so we were making an assumption there that children were being abused more, and that because mandated reporters were not seeing them, that this abuse and neglect would go unchecked. Okay. That assumption, by the way, we're not going to focus on that, but that assumption did not end up being true, which is maybe a different conversation. But anyways, as these conversations were happening, I was part of a group that started to ask themselves a new question, which is this: wait, why are we focusing on reporting abuse and neglect? Why are we not first asking ourselves, how can we support families right now so that abuse and neglect is not happening? Like, why are we jumping to surveillance as opposed to support? And that opened up a bigger conversation, which you have all also probably been part of. And Prevent Child Abuse Arizona got some funding from KC Family Programs to hold focus groups across our state that we called Lean on Me AZ. And in those focus groups, we held 13 of them in various communities across Arizona. They were virtual, of course. And we asked them, how do you support families in your community? And how is your family supported by your community? Like, what does prevention look like in everyday ways where you are? And we did that by first giving them a little protective factors presentation so that they could have the context about, hey, like, this is the frame that we're looking for. We don't want you to talk about reporting. This is not about intervention. It's really about prevention. It's really about support. And what are everyday ways that people are supporting families right now? Because prevention is happening all the time and prevention happens in community. So those are really rich discussions. We had those focus groups. We took tons of notes, and then we distilled it down into a toolkit and a training, and a presentation. And so here's kind of the context that we shared first with these focus groups. This is the outline of Arizona, by the way, for those of you who are not familiar with the outline of Arizona. So we know that the outcomes of building protective factors are stronger families, children who develop optimally, and the prevention of child abuse and neglect. And as we all know, as trainers, there are strategies that we use and that we encourage to build those 5 protective factors. But even those strategies can be a bit vague, right? You need to kind of apply the strategy to your life. So how do you value and support parents? Or everyday ways that you can value and support parents? That's what we asked these focus groups. So again, we took a bunch of notes, pages and pages of notes, and we distilled it down into a toolkit that we called Lean on Me AZ. And we came up with 26 tips and tools for everyday people, you, me, everyday people in community, tips and tools for supporting families where they are. And based on that toolkit, we also created a training. And then we also created a training of trainers. So people are now trained to give presentations on Lean on Me AZ. This presentation today is not about Lean on Me AZ, but I wanted to share a little bit about Lean on Me AZ because of the frame that it helped us have, which led to the development of the Considering Yourself a Mandated Supporter training. Because what this gave to us, Lean on Me AZ, is that people want to prevent child abuse and neglect. People already can come up with ways about how child abuse and neglect can be prevented, and they can point to ways that are already happening. Part of our job as a sector that wants to prevent abuse and neglect and strengthen families is to help people see themselves in what we are trying to envision. So how can we help everyone see themselves in this work of strengthening families and protecting children so that all families and children can thrive? So that really gave us that context. But those focus groups also, I personally facilitated all the focus groups. I sometimes had a co-facilitator. And this was the first year that I was an executive director of the organization that I lead. And those focus groups were incredible contexts that really shaped my frame and my lens for the work of the organization moving forward. Because in a lot of those conversations, especially in conversations with particularly communities of color, particularly African American and Native American communities in Arizona, there was this notion of, gosh, I wish there was something else than just calling the authorities on our families, because it hurts. Because calling the authorities, as we know, it's traumatic, right? At best, it's embarrassing, right? And at worst, it can be deeply traumatic for a family. So a lot of these communities were asking, hey, how can we do this? How can we prevent the need for this system of authority for child protection, for CPS? In our state, it's called DCS. How do we prevent this need for DCS? And there was also this notion that people's first place to go when they had a concern about a family or a child was to call DCS or CPS in some states. That it's so well known that if you have a concern, you call CPS or DCS. But it's not well known that when you have a concern, can you think of resources that are available to support that family, including you? Because community is really the front line of prevention. It is where prevention happens. So this really gave us context. And I'm going to share with you a couple of the stories that came out of those focus groups, because I think that they're really instructive. And again, it points to this need for the training that I'll discuss soon, considering yourself a mandated supporter. So this is a story, this version, or this story came out in almost all focus groups. So people would share something like, gosh, when I was in the grocery store with my 3-year-old, the 3-year-old was having a tantrum, and an older couple came up to me and said, "Well, I remember when mine were that age. You're doing a great job, Mom." Or, I mean, there were versions of that story, but there were some people that shared kind of the opposite of that story. Something like, God, I was in the grocery store with my 2-year-old, and then someone gave me a dirty look and said, "Can't you control your kid?" Right? So that shows the difference between a community that can really show up for parents as an ally to parents, as an entity that normalizes that parenting is stressful and challenging, and that you can't always control your kid. That's not the job of parenting. The job of parenting is not control, turns out. So it really gave a contrast to what can community do to be an ally to parents and families versus one that kind of advances this surveillance mentality and this judgment mentality. I'm going to share one more story that came out of these focus groups. This one's really rich, so I'm going to read it aloud. I had a neighbor call the cops on me. My daughter had just come back from foster care, and the transition was hard for her. She was having a meltdown. I explained this to the cop. He said, "I understand. You're doing a good job." And he left. I went to my neighbor and explained the situation to her too. She apologized. I asked her to please ask me if I needed help before calling the authorities on me again. And I'm going to pause right here, actually, because I want to know from you the strengths that you see in this story, or any reflections that you have on this quote. What do you see here in this story about a woman whose daughter had just come back from foster care? They had reunified, and her daughter was having a hard time adjusting back. The neighbor called the cops on her because she heard screaming, and then the cop came to investigate. Okay, let's see. Lucretia, thank you. So positive affirmations from a position of power. So Lucretia, yeah, one of the things I see in this is the authority, the cop, validated the mom's experience as opposed to kind of looking at her through a judgmental lens. And that was really protective and strengthening. Thank you. Let's see what else. Julie, it took so much courage exactly for that woman to go talk to her neighbor, right? Like, what an amazing person to be able to have a hard conversation with a neighbor and to ask her to ask if she needed help versus calling the authorities. Again, yeah, this woman was incredible. Amanda, mom is recognizing that her daughter is struggling and remained calm with law enforcement. Yes, incredible strength, right? Supportive first responder, Isfazia. Yes, rather than retaliating, she confronted her neighbor positively and with courage. Yeah, totally, right? So this is an amazing story. This is amazing, right? And we don't often hear stories like this, but through stories like this, we had a lot of this kind of vibe, like, wow, I wish people would just talk to each other more and know each other more, so we wouldn't just rely on the authorities to solve the problems that the authorities actually sometimes are not equipped to solve. So we had a lot of that in those discussions, and it was really beautiful. So thank you for your reflections on that. And so, like I said, a couple of tips and tools came out of Lean On Me AZ, and we were able to distribute those tips and tools. Okay, so based on that experience in which we formed this training called Lean On Me AZ, and we were trying to talk to people in terms of everyday ways that they could support and strengthen families. A little bit later, we learned, Prevent Child Abuse Arizona learned, that Arizona was going to create a standard mandated reporting training specifically for educators. So we learned about this because there was a bill in the House that was going to require the state to create a standard mandated reporting training for educators. Now, we had not had a standard training before. I know that there are some states that already have a standard that every mandated reporter is supposed to take, and there may be concerns and problems with that. But in Arizona, we literally had no standard. Everyone could give their own version of whatever presentation that they wanted. You, me, your mom, like the person down the street, there was no standard. And we knew that that was not the way to get clear information to mandated reporters, right, on their responsibility to report. So we thought this was very promising, that there was going to be a standard that was going to be created. And so when we learned about that, I approached the Department of Child Safety, which is our state's CPS, and I asked them, hey, when you create the standard mandated reporting training, could we maybe add a slide in there about how to resource families? Because not all concerns rise to the level of abuse and neglect. And can we also talk about bias? And can we at least talk about disproportionality, that there are certain communities that are over referred to the department or over surveilled by the department? So can we add some slides to your training? And the answer I got was no, we cannot do that because we really want a training specifically only on mandated reporting. But they said, we will offer you some funding to develop a parallel training. And I was like, okay, I'll take that. So Prevent Child Abuse Arizona partnered with two organizations in our state. One is the ACEs consortium, so the Adverse Childhood Experiences Consortium. You likely all know about Adverse Childhood Experiences. That is an organization that works to advance trauma-informed knowledge in Arizona and knowledge of the effects of ACEs. And we also partner with Onward Hope, which is a Black-led organization that also is led by someone with lived experience of child protection system. And we really wanted that lens as well on this training. So we partnered with those two organizations. And so how did we develop this training? We knew that we wanted something to teach people that were mandated reporters how they can also support families, because we knew that not all concerns about children and families are abuse and neglect, but that people don't know where else to call typically if they have a concern that is not abuse and neglect. So they end up calling the abuse and neglect hotline. And we also knew that 50% of calls that go into the hotline that have concerns about children and families are screened out. So they don't meet the statutory definition for abuse and neglect. And to us, that meant, wow, well, we have a lot of people who are calling in about concerns, but it's not abuse and neglect, it's something else. And in our state, they don't get referred anywhere else. So you call in, if it doesn't meet the threshold, they're like, okay, this doesn't meet the threshold. Have a nice day. There's nothing else that happens. So because there's nothing else that happens, can we teach mandated reporters to understand that they're in actually pretty good position to also consider themselves mandated supporters? Because oftentimes mandated reporters are the people that are working with children or working with families. So they already have a relationship. They already understand more about the child or the family than an investigator ever would. So they're in a position to be better messengers for resourcing, support, protective factors related stuff. So on that premise, we wanted to develop a training. Okay, Okay, so how did we develop this training? We first started with 2 groups of parents. So we paid 2 groups of, we held 2 focus groups of parents, paid them to attend these focus groups. And the majority of those parents had lived experience of the child protection system in some way, either getting a report called on them, either having a child removed from their home, really the whole gamut. And in those focus groups, we asked the parents what their experience and understanding of the Department of Child Safety process was. We wanted to know what they thought about mandated reporting and what they understood happened once a report went into the hotline. We're just gathering those perceptions. And a couple of things came out of those focus groups. Again, very instructive, very rich. If ever you have a chance to have the honor of facilitating focus groups to really inform projects, do, because when you hear from actual people and not just systems theorists, and systems theorists are great, okay, but people with lived experience have the answers. And we know this. They have the answers, not just the information, but they also have the emotion behind it and the reason why. That really, it brings the heart to our work. So hold focus groups if you can. Anyways, 2 things that came out of those parent focus groups are, 1, parents know that there's a role for child protection systems. So what surprised me is that, I expect a lot of anger, like, oh, the system sucks and the system needs to be reformed. And there was some of that, but by and large, a lot of parents said, we know that there's a role for this and it's important to have a child protection agency that's responsible for that. And I wish that there was something else that mandated reporters also knew about so that they could refer families to resources. And interestingly, the parents with lived experience of having their children removed from them, a couple of them said something like this: I really am thankful for the experience of being involved in child protection, because without my involvement in child protection, I would never have found out about the resources that were available to help me. And that was really interesting to me, because what they were saying is, I'm grateful that I got involved in the department because they opened up resources that I didn't know existed. And to us, what that showed is that we can cut out the middleman. Like, we could have another way to connect families to what they need that is not the child protection department. So it doesn't need to be just the department's role to refer families to resources. And the way that they refer families to resources is sometimes, often, by force, right? Like, you need to do this in order to get your children back. So that was interesting to us in terms of this notion of creating another way to connect families to resources if resources are what they need. Okay, so we held those 2 groups with parents. And then the next groups that we convened were educators, because we were really designing this training for educators. So why educators? Well, in our state, about a quarter of the calls that go into the Department of Child Safety hotline are from educators. So those are teachers, administrators, social workers within schools, the people who work in schools. And we also know that the educator group is the least accurate reporter of child abuse and neglect. And this is not to give any disrespect to educators, but as a group, educators are the least likely to report something that is actually found out to be abuse and neglect. So there's a lot of concerns that they're referring to the department that don't end up being in the department's purview to address. 93% of calls from educators in our state don't end up being about abuse and neglect. They end up about being something else. So to us, that was an opportunity. If so many calls are coming in from educators, can we educate educators on how to resource families? So that's why we focused on that population. So we held 3 sets of focus groups of educators. So we had 3 focus groups and they each met 3 times. In the first session, we gathered information from educators about their perception of the mandated reporting process and what they thought happened once they called in to the DCS hotline. And again, that was super, super interesting. We didn't bust or correct any misperceptions at the time. We were really there to gather their perception and their impression of the mandated reporting process and what they thought occurred at the level of the Department of Child Safety. And again, super interesting focus group. A few things that came out of that group were that there's a lot of feelings about mandated reporting. I'm sure that you can probably think of a few thoughts and feelings that you have about the process of mandated reporting. A lot of educators in that group said that it was a really emotional process to even decide to make a report. That they had a lot of anxiety, they had a lot of fear. They feared not reporting, and they also feared reporting. So they feared not reporting because they knew, based on whatever mandated reporting training that they had gotten in the past, that their job was on the line, that they were going to be personally liable if they don't report something. So really they have this fear of God like put into them. You must report if you suspect, or else you'll get in trouble. But they were also afraid of calling. And they were afraid of calling because for four big reasons. One, they were afraid that the parents would retaliate against them. So they were afraid of retaliation. Two, they thought that parents would retaliate against children. Three, they thought they would lose the trusting relationship that they had with either parents or children, meaning that they could not be effective supporters or helpers anyways if they made a call. And then four, they were afraid that the child or the family would just disappear, or that the parents would pull them from the school, or that basically they would never, kind of another version of losing a relationship with the child or the family. So there's a lot of fear around reporting, a lot of feelings. Crystal, I see that you have a question. Do you want to unmute and ask your question? And Crystal, I'm not hearing you. If you would rather not speak, you can type your question into either the chat or the Q&A, and I'd be happy to address it.
I had to first allow her to speak. So you should be able to now unmute yourself, Crystal.
Thank you, Kaylin. Thanks. Crystal, would you like to ask your question?
I'm sorry, I missed and hit the hand.
Oh, okay. No worries. No worries. Okay. All right. So that first session for educators, we asked them their thoughts on the mandated reporting process. In the second session that we met, we fed them back the information that they had reviewed in their first session. So we compiled all the impressions of mandated reporting from all three of the educator first focus groups, and we shared with them the summaries of what other educators were thinking. And we also shared with them the data on the reality. So including that about half of calls that go into the Department of Child Safety hotline don't even get screened in for investigation, meaning that they don't meet the definition of abuse and neglect and nothing else happens, right? And that was actually pretty surprising to a lot of the educators, because one misperception that we uncovered is that a lot of educators, a lot of mandated reporters in this case, think that whenever they have a call that goes into this Department of Child Safety hotline, something is going to be done. There is going to be something done about it. But in at least 50% of the time, literally nothing happens. They take it as information, but nothing else happens. There's no check-in with the family. There's not even a referral of resources to the mandated reporter. So really it is nothing. And that was a bit surprising. Some educators said, interestingly, how can we make them do something about it? So to me, that was their first reaction oftentimes. Is there something that we have to say to make them go out there and investigate? And that was interesting because what that tells me is they're really concerned. They want something to be done. They want someone to do something about it, right? And they don't feel like they can. And so someone needs to help. So if nothing's being done, then whose responsibility is it to help? That's what they asked. And we said, well, we're sorry to tell you this, but it's you and me and everyone else. Like, it is all of our responsibility to promote and advance child and family well-being. And that was a bit overwhelming to them because they want something done, right? That they have a concern and they want something to do something about it. We also shared with them the data on disproportionality. So in our state, an African-American or Black child is 4 times as likely to be reported to the Department of Child Safety Hotline as a white child. So our disproportionality in the state is pretty elevated. And there was a lot of discussion around that as well. I'm going to share on that a little bit later because one of my pieces of advice is to, if you're bringing up disproportionality and reporting, be cautious of how you frame it. Because sometimes sharing something like, oh, well, a Black child is 4 times more likely to be reported to the child safety hotline than a white child, to me, my interpretation of that would be like, oh, wow, there's a lot of bias in mandated reporting. People are surveilling Black and African-American families more. To me, my conclusion is, oh, there's bias. To other people, it could be, wow, why are Black families mistreating their children at such high rates? So they kind of see reports as truth. So when you talk about disproportionality, keep that in mind because people may not come to the same conclusions as you do. All right, so after that we had that session, we had a third and final session in which we asked them, okay, now that you know a little bit more about the reality of the process in the system, and you know that the DCS system is not designed or equipped to deal with the concerns that you're reporting about a lot of the time, what can we put in a training that helps educators understand their role as not just reporters, but also supporters? And so then we got a bunch of advice from educators, and then we created a training. Oh, and here are a couple of the things I've already addressed. So for the parents, again, they understand that there is a place for child protection, but they also wish that there was a better way to access support and resources. And for educators, they had a bunch of these misperceptions that we were working to address. One, they think that the child protection system does something about everything. 2, a lot of them thought it was really the place to call if they had any concern about a child or a family, which it's not. In our state especially, it is designed to be an investigation system that really investigates child abuse and neglect if it has happened. It is not the place to call to get families resources that they need, which is not necessarily educators' fault because, at least in our state, the Department of Child Safety has been inconsistent in its messaging. So under some directors, they want to encourage everyone to call so that the department can be the one that really refers families to resources. Under certain directors, they said, no, please don't send all families to me. Only send families that you suspect abuse and neglect. So they've been kind of inconsistent in the role that they've had in the community. So educators really perceive that it's the place to call. That's the one stop to call and they will deal with it, which is not true. And then the third misperception that they had is that a lot of them didn't realize that they could be supporters. So even the small but insignificant thing of giving people permission to think differently was a shift for them, which is great to share with you because you're all familiar with the Strengthening Families Protective Factors framework, and we're all about small but significant changes. And we're all about mindset shift and changing your frame as a way to change who you are and how you behave. Just giving themselves permission to think about how they might be able to support a child or a family was enough for some educators to really understand that they were not just reporters, but they could also be supporters. So if you take nothing else from this presentation, it is that just sharing the message that people can support and report, like it doesn't have to be either or, they can be mandated reporters, they are according to law, but can they also consider themselves a mandated supporter? Okay, so then we created a training. And then we went back to the educator groups and we said, is this what you want? And they gave us feedback. And then because it was funded by the Department of Child Safety, interestingly, we gave it to the Department of Child Safety and they gave us feedback. So it was very multi-stakeholder training that was a compilation of lots and lots of feedback and information. And if you're interested in seeing the full version of the final product, it can be found on this website. I'm going to go through a little bit of it, but if you want to see the whole thing, or really it's a recording of me giving the presentation, please go to that site. It is the second video on that site. And Kaylin has the PDF of this presentation for you. Okay, and then we also, so after that we created this training, we held a training of trainers with 20 protective factors trainers. The reason that we chose protective factors trainers to be the only people that would be allowed to pilot this initial training, considering yourself a mandated supporter, is because we know that once you take the protective factors training, you have this frame. You have this frame in which you're really building a culture of support and not surveillance. So these 20 people on this picture were trained to give the considering yourself a mandated supporting training. So now I'm going to share a few of the slides of the training that we created. I'm not going to actually go through them as if I'm giving a presentation, but I'm going to explain why we chose these slides. So here it is, the opening slide. So the goal that we share from the get-go with people is that this training is designed to help people who work with children and families, all of which in our state are mandated reporters, to understand ways to connect families to resources and support so that they can reduce family overwhelm. We use that term, overwhelm or overload, so that child maltreatment can be prevented. So from the get-go, we say, this is not a mandated reporting training. You should have already gotten a mandated reporting training. This training is to help you understand your role in supporting and connecting families, because by supporting and connecting families, you are preventing child abuse and neglect. Here's the outline of the training. So we included information on whose responsibility is it to protect children from harm and to advance child well-being. We talk about bias and that everyone has it. We all make assumptions. That's how human brains work. We talk about bias and assumptions and just checking our thinking. Then we talk about what it means to support families. So we ask people what it means to them. We talk about the protective factors. There's a slide on specifically the protective factors because it's a great frame. And then we support them to find resources and think about ways that they can find resources where they are. Because the challenge here in Arizona is that we don't have one hotline or one place to go to find what's available for families. We don't have kind of an alternate system. And actually, developing this training has guided us to determine that that should be our main focus. We need to create a statewide system of family support that gets families what they need when they need it. And really, this training shaped that vision for the future of our organization. So in this training, we help people brainstorm ways that they might be able to find resources where they are. Is there a go-to person in their school district that knows where a lot of resources are? Do they have a family resource center in their school district? Some of them do, and they don't even know what that family resource center does, right? So even getting them to think, who would you talk to if you wanted to get a family resource? And then we give them tips and tools about how to engage families. They're sharing resources in both passive ways, like newsletters and bulletin boards, but also active ways, like through conversations. So here's a slide on the shared responsibility of child well-being. And this little visual here, the continuum of well-being to lack of safety, was something that was requested by our Department of Child Safety that we explain, because this is nuanced. It is not black and white. It is not clear. And that is why it's so hard to have these kinds of conversations, because we are not telling people not to report if they suspect abuse and neglect. But abuse and neglect and the interpretation of what you see changes for every person based on your experience. We all have bias. We all have assumptions that we make based on our own history. So we can't just say, well, do this for this and do this for this, because it always depends. But we use this diagram of well-being to lack of safety because the Department of Child Safety is really there for children who are unsafe. They are not there for children who are at risk of being unsafe. That is still the community's responsibility to resource. So sometimes we have conversations about this continuum because some people think that as soon as you have a risk, you call the Department of Child Safety. but they're not designed or equipped to actually be able to do that. We talk about how child maltreatment is largely preventable. People need to know this, that by supporting families, that is an action that you can take to prevent harm from happening in the first place by building protective factors. We talk about neglect, and that a lot of neglect is related to poverty. There's poverty-related neglect. And in general, neglect is exacerbated by overload or overwhelm. So we talk about this concept of overwhelm. When any human being is feeling too much stress, they are less able to do the things that help them and their family function. That's just how human beings also work. So we talk about how when stress goes up, it increases the likelihood of neglect, such as inability to care for your children, to substance use issues, to mental illness and domestic violence. So all the things that we're seeing in terms of the neglect that happens has to do with overload and overwhelm. When we connect families to what they need, we are reducing that overload and that overwhelm. We also show them this little video, which I'm actually going to show you right now. You may have seen it. It is from the UK, actually. And if you have not seen it, or even if you have seen it, a reminder that the word lorry means truck. The word lorry means truck. So let's watch this video together.
When a lorry carries too much weight, it can be overloaded to the point of breaking down. And when parents are burdened with stresses like poverty or lack of support, the weight of these problems can overload their mental and emotional capacity to take care of their children's needs. Over time, carrying and managing heavy burdens puts a strain on people and can weaken their ability to care for their children. And when an especially large burden is loaded onto a person who is already overloaded, such as the loss of a job or a relationship ending, it can cause a breakdown in care. However, just as we can unload an overloaded lorry by bringing in other lorries or moving some things by train instead, we can provide a range of different types of support that offload sources of stress from overloaded parents and improve their capacity to care for their children.
I love that video. And we included it because the parents who were advising the development of this training and the educators really thought that it explained it in a very real way. To me, I really can see myself in that video. And oftentimes when we're working in the sector of children and families, there can be a lot of like you and me. There can be a difference between systems leaders and the people that we're intended to serve, like this otherness, right? Whereas that doesn't actually exist. Like we are all part of families. We are all part of communities. Some of us have more stressors than others because of the conditions that we're in. But we can't think of this as like a separate issue from ourselves. And I love that video. Yeah. And Maggie, we can get you that link. And back to Morgan already has it. Beautiful. Thank you, Morgan. Okay, so after that we watch that video and talk about it, we also talk about biases and assumptions. And we use the activity that many of you have seen. This is kind of the original, I forget what it's called, the changing your perspective, changing your frame. I don't know, this cartoon image, which is such a good tool for learning, because this is a very non-threatening way to explore your own biases. That we tend to see safety threats first, and that's not wrong. It's not wrong to see threats to safety and even see threats to safety first, because we all want to keep ourselves safe, and safety is very important to human beings for our survival. So really acknowledging that. And then using this image, we ask questions like, well, what assumptions are you making about this family? Right? Just tell me the story that you're telling about this family to yourself, because we all make assumptions about the people that we see. And then we talk about culture. After this activity, we talk about the disproportionality issue. The reason that we do that first, and the reason honestly that we use a white family first, because this cartoon looks like a white family, is because it's less threatening to kind of toy with to reflect on your own biases and assumptions when it is not immediately linked to race from the get-go. So we chose to kind of ease the training into that, to talk about disproportionality after this, once people have the frame of biases. Also to try to combat against the effects of misinterpreting the disproportionality data. So that's why we do that. And then we talk about standards, and that what standards we're comparing people to, that we help reflect on, that we all compare people to our own standards. And oftentimes when we're making a decision to report, it's because this family or child is living in a very different way than we are. So just thinking about the standard that you're comparing yourself to might help to be aware of biases that you may have. Okay, now we share with them the protective factors when we talk about what families need. And again, this is a frame of strengths and building something versus stopping something and taking it away. I'll go through it a little bit. Then we talk about why we need to find resources for families and connect them, and that this is a prime way to especially build concrete support for families. And we have a discussion about, in their organization, their school district, how do they find resources? If they wanted to support a family that they know of right now, or they think of them in their heads, we ask them to picture one. Who would you call? What peer would you call in your school district to troubleshoot it or to help find resources? There often is a go-to person that people are thinking about already. They just it may not occur to them that they have the permission, or there's the possibility of just having a conversation to collaborate with that person. So again, it's helping guide people to think a little bit differently, not necessarily transform everything, small but significant. Right? Then we share tips about sharing resources with families. So, and these include normalizing help seeking. So for example, sharing resources often with everyone and repeatedly, so that people, it becomes normalized that the teacher is going to share resources with families, regardless of whether or not she thinks that they need it. By constantly sharing resources, it normalizes that this is just something that we do. It's very normal for parents to access support. So we talk about tips and tools about how to make support more accessible, and yet to encourage that support is taken advantage of. So here are some other tips. Then we have a list of resources to start. Again, our state does not have one place to go to start navigating what's available in your own community. And like I said, this really launched our desire to build that system. And so what we're doing is we're starting with our family resource centers and identifying where they are in our state, because we know of a few of them, but we don't know where all of them are. And we think that family resource centers can have a unique position as being the foundation of an infrastructure of family support. So can we refer families to their most local family resource center? Can we refer professionals to their most local family resource center as a place to start? Non-judgmental, trauma-informed place to start. That's the vision that we've created based on this. And Julie is asking, have you thought about going through this process with law enforcement? And yes, we're starting with educators to see how they receive it. And but we have gotten permission to start giving this training to all mandated reporters. Okay, so I have no time left, and I'm going to pass it on to Kaylin, but a few things in terms of snags and lessons learned. So we're hitting a couple of roadblocks here in Arizona, because originally we had planned to pair this with that standard mandated reporting training that was being created. That training has been created, but the rollout of it is non-existent. They've created a recording of it, like a Zoom recording, and then they posted it on the DCS website. That's their entire implementation plan. So it's our vision of pairing it is no longer going to happen. There is absolutely this perception that by even getting people to think about how they might be able to support and resource families, that we're telling them not to report. This is not true. And I cannot say it, sometimes, I cannot say it more. We are not telling people not to report. We are not discouraging reporting. We are discouraging unnecessary reporting for things that are not able to be addressed by the system. So people can report and support. It doesn't have to be either or. Also asking educators to do one more thing can be overwhelming. I've talked about the framing of racial bias and disproportionality. And this training is not giving you a clear thing to do or to say, right? It does not give you guidance about how to support or how to report specifically. You still have to use your own judgment. And so people will still kind of bring up scenarios and ask for your advice on what they should do. You'll still not be in a position to advise them. It's really up to them still. So it doesn't solve all the problem, but it's a direction to help people see themselves as not just reporters, but supporters. Okay, it's my contact information. And I'm going to pass it back to Kaylin. Would you like me to stop sharing my screen?
Yes, and I'll go back to sharing mine. Thank you so much. This is such great content, and the experiences you had along the way in developing this are just really powerful to hear about. So thank you for that. I am going to quickly share a few updates from CSSP. I mentioned that our webinar in February will be focused on this new paper about strengthening families. You've all heard me saying for months, if not longer, that we have a new paper coming out. So I'm really excited that it is coming out. And along with that, we will have updated implementation materials, which will be rolling out throughout the year. We have a new logo that you'll see on that February call. Very exciting. And we hope you'll join us and also learn about some opportunities that'll be coming up to dig deeper and connect with other people in the network about these new materials. And we welcome opportunities to share in 2024. So if you have a conference, if there's a webinar we could join, something like that, please reach out and let me know. And Charlene and I will figure out who can join you. I also wanted to share that the new neighborhood, the podcast, I have the joy of co-hosting with Sanaa Sharif. That has been wrapped up for season 3. I'm just scrolling through a few of our episodes from this season so you can see the types of topics we covered and guests we had. They've been great conversations about different work happening in communities to benefit kids and families. And the last one popping up actually was through our partners at the Idaho Association for Education of Young Children, longtime Strengthening Families partners, and looking at some of the work they're doing with early learning coalitions across the state in Idaho. So that feels like a Strengthening Families connection, in addition to the local early childhood system building angle. So check that out. We also have a live stream coming up on January 25th. About removing the barriers from culturally responsive services. My colleague Essie Hutchful will be hosting that and participating on the panel. So join that. It's a live stream, so you don't need to join. You don't need to register, but you can find the details on our website. And I'm going to hand off to Maureen to share some updates from the Alliance.
Thank you. And Claire, fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for your leadership in this area. I think it's great. Just a quick update. We have a training of trainers coming up just here in a few weeks. So actually, if you're interested in attending, you would have to register right away. But we will share dates with you on upcoming trainings. I am also putting in the chat box where you can find more information on the training of trainers and my email address. So just let me know if you need any information. And thank you and Happy New Year, everybody.
Wonderful. Thanks, Maureen. And so many thanks to Claire. I'm really glad that you were able to share this information. I think people were really excited to hear it and got their minds thinking, got their wheels turning about what they could do in their own communities. And appreciate your willingness for people to reach out to you. We will wrap up now, but I see that Rodney Jackson has his hand up. So Rodney, I'm going to allow you to speak if you like. Others might need to jump off, but we can stay on for a minute. You'll need to unmute yourself. That could have been an accidental hand raise as well. That does happen. Okay, well, that ended.
You said it was an accident.
It was an accident. Okay, I didn't see that in the chat. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Claire. And I did see a few people asking questions about whether they can take the training. they may or may not still be on, but maybe that's something we could put in the follow-up email too.